Hope everybody is hydrating out there and staying healthy. My name is Robbie Russell, and I'm the CEO of Planet Argon. We're a software consultancy based in Portland, Oregon, in the US that helps companies with existing Ruby on Rails applications make them better and more maintainable. So this is something that we do quite often when companies come our way with their code base. And so we're trying to basically take some of our processes and share that with other developers so they can get a feel for how other people might be, just to get a fresh perspective on how their own applications are doing at this point in time. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, I'd like to outline what we're going to be covering, and I'm going to make some assumptions. So as this webinar is being exclusively offered to subscribers to Maintainable Rails, we didn't publish this on the internet anywhere else. So for everybody that's watching or listening and watching, we're going to make an assumption that you're likely a software developer. You have access to and are working on an existing Ruby on Rails application. And perhaps you've been lucky enough to be around the application since it was first developed, but maybe you just recently joined a team that has an existing Ruby on Rails application. So I'm hoping that these topics will be really applicable to both of those types of scenarios. And for extra credit, if you have space on your computer right now or in your window, you might consider opening up one of your Ruby on Rails applications in your preferred code editor so that you can spot check a few things as we go. I'm also going to make the assumption that you know that you'll not be the last person to ever have to work on your application. So our goal today is to make life a little simpler for your application's future developers, which may include you. So our goal is just to share a little bit about what we're doing here. And again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them, and we'll have 2 Q&A sessions. So first up, let's just talk a little bit. What I'm basically going to do is we're going to have 8 different sections we're going to walk through that are going to be kind of high level. We're going to have some follow-up webinars to get a little bit more in the weeds on some specific topics, but we'll kind of start kind of high. And some of this stuff might be really simple for some of you. Some of you may not be familiar with this. So I'm hoping we'll kind of cover the gamut here. So first of all, as we're thinking about your Ruby on Rails application, quick question: where do you look to determine what version of Ruby your application is running? So as a default, I would expect this to be documented in 2 different places. So firstly, ideally in the root of your Rails directory, you have a .ruby version file. And the reason why we prefer this as a kind of our first point of check, because we're going to assume that quite a number of you are using something like a Ruby version manager like RBMV or RVM. And so just from our own experience, we're much Planet Argon. We all use RBMV, and we used to use RVM several years ago. And I highly recommend that you consider using one of these 2 tools. And one of the nice things about having in this location is that it's a convention that the community is aware of. If you're using like a OS-based install and you don't even know what version of Ruby you're using, that could be problematic. So we'll touch on a few things there as well. But secondly, we'd also like to see this kind of documented near the top of your gem file. So it's duplicated in 2 places. And I've been guilty of this myself. I've tried to get clever in a gem file and have it automatically source the version for Ruby version so that we're not violating any, and I'm like air quoting, dry principles. But I actually don't think you should be that clever, because there's some problems and it can introduce some weird things with bundler. So you can duplicate this in 2 places, and at least you know where those are at. And the reason why you want to have this at the top of the gem file is so that bundler can do what it's really good at, making sure that you're installing gems for the right version. So especially if you have multiple Ruby on Rails applications on your, say, local laptop or software development environment, I'm making the assumption that you have a laptop or a computer somewhere that you're developing on and you're not developing on a live server somewhere. But these are 2 places I think you should have this documented. Where I'm less interested in seeing it documented is in a README file. The reason being that it's an area for documentation, and we'll see a lot of applications that we'll be taking a look at, and they'll have a version, a list of things like Ruby, Rails, Postgres versions, Redis versions, and a number of other dependencies. But I don't think you actually need to list out the Rails version or the Ruby version in this specific location. I would, again, just kind of defer people to look at the Ruby version file, maybe even include a link in the README file to that file, but I wouldn't go ahead and just like list it there, because it will be another place that has to get changed. So instead of every time you bump Ruby, you have to do it in 2 places, you now have to do it in 3 places and potentially other places. So just those 2 sections of the Ruby version of the gem file, I think, are adequate enough for most projects. And let's not even get into the fact that you might also have this kind of trickle out into other things if you're using like something like Circle CI and Docker, and maybe you need to have the version that reference there as well. So you can kind of get into that in another conversation. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the gem file itself. So a few things that we quickly spot check on. And so, one thing that's still surprises me, because we do look at applications that have been around for 10 plus years sometimes, is that they might not be using SSL to install gems. So every time, there was once a period of time when all of the Ruby gems that we've installed, even before Bundler, were not installed over SSL. And so to have them make sure that transaction between you and the Ruby gem servers is encrypted, make sure that your where it sources Ruby gems or whatever mirror you're using is using SSL, and not, you should make sure there's at least that HTTPS part of the source. And we also like to see the Ruby version, as I was saying, listed towards the top of the file. Just put that smack dab, like the second or third line in your file there. And contrary to what I'm going to say in a few moments, I would also encourage you to have the Rails version listed up towards the top of the file as well, because those are the two things that people probably want to know when they're getting a sense of what's going on with the application. What version of Ruby and what version of Rails is your application relying on? And then another thing in your gem files is if you have a list of gems that don't have versions next to them listed in your gem file, then you are potentially playing this fun game of when someone runs bundle update, and then you might hit some issues where dependencies don't match up anymore. And if you don't have a really healthy test suite, which we'll also touch on in a little bit, then that's going to kind of bite you in the butt. So I would encourage you to try to lock your versions of gems to within some ranges there, and we'll include out some links and articles in the mailing list for you to kind of touch on some like better best practices and like show you some specific examples there as well. A thing that I'm very encouraging of, because I really want you to consider alphabetizing your gems, and that might seem completely unnecessary, but the gem file itself, not the gemfile.lock, because the gemfile.lock file is more for Bundler to do its thing, but the gem file itself is mainly going to be used and consumed by other developers who are reading it. So there are a lot of different ways how you can organize a list of dependencies. If you wanted to get, I think Alphabetico is really effective for teams because it helps other developers know where they should stick their gem dependency versus it just being the next one you add at the bottom. So it shouldn't be necessarily a chronological order of gems. I don't think I've seen that happen, but I feel like usually it feels a little random when you look at a gem file. And since this file is mainly going to be consumed by other humans reading it, put it in a natural order, like alphabetizing it so that they can kind of dive in and quickly get a feel for where things should go and where they're going to add their gem dependencies. Another thing is to use gem file groups. So, well, I said you could be alphabetical, but you can also be alphabetical within specific groups. So for example, are you using development, test, staging, production groups so that you can make sure that you're only installing the gems necessary for that specific environment? For example, you may not need New Relic, or maybe you're using some third-party application tools or bug tracking tools like Bugsnag, what have you, and you may not need that installed in your development environment or in your test environment. So you might only want that, say, in staging production. So you might have specific gems that will get installed in those environments, but not in your development and test environment, and vice versa. Likewise, you probably don't need to be installing RSpec dependencies on your production servers because you're probably not going to run your test suite out there ever. And so that'll help do things like just speed up the overall build process of your systems, your deployment process. That's just a few less things for it to check each time, and you can get a little bit more control. You can also put in details like making sure gems aren't required unless they're necessary. So let's moving forward. I want to move on beyond the gem file here, and we're going to talk a little bit about security for a moment. So I'm hoping most of you have. If you haven't heard of this tool, Bundler Audit, you are going to be familiar with it by the end of this conversation. So, but for those that are already familiar with it, that's great. I hope you're using it in your build stack. So there's a tool called Bundler Audit, and it's this great tool that was developed a number of years ago, which you can install, it's a gem, and when you run it, it's going to tell you and compare the gem versions that your application are currently relying on, whether or not there are any known security vulnerabilities. And so it'll even kind of give you a hint as to how severe that issue is. So as a quick example, I literally pulled up a project that I recently got asked to look at and ran bundler audit. And we can see we have an issue where Action View has some known cross-site vulnerability or cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in Action View. There's some issues with Bootstrap and Devise, and this went on with a number of things. And so all I had to do was run bundler audit. You can bake this into your development process in your team's build process as well. So for example, if you have if you're using like continuous integration like CircleI, you can set up a specific job that would say run this every day. And so, for example, one of the things that we've been doing is on a lot of our projects is we'll have CircleCI will build every branch that gets pushed to, but then every morning, a couple hours before our office hours start at Planet Oregon, all of our apps get cross-checked we'll run a bundle update, or they'll run through the process, and it's not going to run all the tests at that moment, but it's going to run bundler audit at a specific time. And if there's any feedback from bundler audit that there's some new known vulnerabilities, that will pop into our Slack channel for that specific project. So that when we start our day, there is a list of like, hey, there's a new vulnerability, and we can determine if it's important enough for us to try to address it that day. So that way we're kind of staying up to date almost on a daily basis with these things, and that definitely helps just keep up on top of those. Because if you check this like maybe once every few months, you'll find that you have several gems that need to get updated. And sometimes you can get these weird issues like, well, there's other dependencies and maybe you're hitting some testing problems. So it's much easier to address these things on a, kind of on a daily basis rather than queuing them up where if you run this and you have 20 items come back, then it's going to be a much bigger thing. And so what's likely happens with a lot of development teams is they'll just kind of push and punt that off a little bit. And that means that nobody's going to kind of take care of that. And at least it's not going to be a quick fix and thing to keep on top of. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is, I'm not going to go through all the benefits of why automated testing is really important and why you should have a comprehensive collection of tests in your application. You probably have heard that a number of times, and we can spend a whole webinar diving into a lot of those things. But one of the things is that when we're looking at a new application to us, where I would say an existing application that comes our way, we'll look at and just to see how often those tests were last modified. And you might be able to do that just kind of like looking in a GitHub repository and see that the directory hadn't been changed in a while. But we run a quick command that we can help us determine this, and there's just like using git log, and it'll basically give us some output kind of like this that will show us that this application's last had some changes made to it in like the spec directory. Say in this specific example, it was only a couple of days ago, but it's not uncommon for us to have applications come our way where they haven't touched it in over a year or something, and that can be a concern. And so that often means that testing hasn't been a priority for the software developers that are working on the project, or maybe they're not familiar and know enough about how to go about testing those applications. So some of those other common stories include perhaps the original developer didn't have a lot of tests to begin with, and the other developers that come on the project pick up that software project and began, they don't know where to start adding or maybe they start working on they take over an application and the test suite is already failing and it's a big mess and they don't know where to begin. And so they're like, oh, I'll get to that one someday maybe. And then someday maybe becomes like 6 months or 12 months later, and then they haven't really baked it into their process. So other things we've seen is that test suites will start failing when they're trying to attempt a Ruby on Rails upgrade. And so they just kind of like put it off to the side, or maybe even like comment out a bunch of tests, and then nobody's really relying on them. But they're not able to maybe or then they kind of brute force a Ruby on Rails upgrade and just kind of abandon the test suite temporarily, but they don't pick that back up. And that can be quite problematic. And perhaps, there's a scenario where you or the person that worked on it was a solo developer and maybe they didn't know how to write tests maybe they read a couple blog posts, but they just never really understood it. And maybe because they didn't have any coworkers, they can kind of keep the mental model of the application in their head. So they didn't really see a lot of value in producing tests because it seemed like a nice to have, not a need to have. But that becomes problematic when other people need to get introduced to the project, because then they don't know how the application is supposed to work. And if that other developer is no longer there, then they don't have that answer and they don't have any tests to kind of help document how things should be working. Another common maybe excuse I hear is that stakeholders don't have a lot of budget. So developers tend to, in those scenarios, be quick and dirty about things like, we'll just get this out and then we'll come back and look at these, clean things up later if necessary. But if necessary is something that clients are rarely going to ask for. In our opinion, from our experience, it's something you kind of need to encourage and push for as a software developer when you're doing when you're working as a developer. You don't have to ask a software. You shouldn't have to ask your stakeholders or your product owners for permission to do a good job with your thing. So when you're working on estimates with clients, make sure you're factoring in spending time on improving the code base and introducing tests, because how do you know the application actually does what it's supposed to? And you might say, well, I tested it manually, but if you don't have any automated tests, you can't. We're trying to help expedite and speed up that process for people. Another quick thing to just maybe consider is if you do have automated tests and they are working, I would encourage you to maybe once a month or once every quarter, document what the average length it takes for you to run that test suite and to see if it's been growing over a period of time, because you might also want to spend some time on looking to ways to optimize how long it takes to actually speed them up. And there's a number of articles that I've included in the mailing list for that, and we can touch on that more at another time, but that's something you might also want to take into account, because if it takes you an hour or two to get feedback from your CI system, or if you're trying to run those tests locally, then that could be problematic. So I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our platinum level sponsors, Pied Piper, makers of the new internet we all deserve. All right, so we're about halfway through these topics, and I wanted to open up for a short, brief Q&A session. So if you have some quick questions, feel free just to plug them in, and I'm going to pull that up now. Got a question about someone that came in a little bit late, but we'll include a link to kind of the I think we'll recap this in an email and stuff like that as well. But basically, it was related to your Ruby gem, your gem file, and where you document your Ruby version. All right, and we're going to go ahead and continue on. So the next thing, and these kind of checking through your application, I want to talk a little bit more about security. So let's be honest for a moment. Does your application have any hard-coded credentials somewhere in your repository? Checked into your Git repository? It's okay. It's not an uncommon thing. But I'm talking about things like API keys, user passwords, maybe you have SMTP mailing credentials, and that could be problematic. And so the reason I say that is because when every person that checks out that application is going to have those credentials, and that is concerning, and it means anyone that ever had it, and it will be in the history. So you can remove it from your Git repository, and there's some ways to do that. You can look in, if you do a quick Google search for how to remove all history of something, there is some workarounds you can get to do that. But quite often, every time we inherit a project or we're asked to review code, we'll find anywhere from 3 to 5 different usernames and passwords hard-coded in the application. Quite often, we'll find them in their config directory, maybe in an environment file. There's YAML files that have these things. And I understand why it's quick and easy to do that, but long-term, you don't want that, because when you make a change for that, you don't want to have to necessarily go into your code, make a commit change, push it out, and then test and see if it's working in a production now. So, there's a lot of good built-in patterns now with Rails. And so Rails has the ability to use stored encrypted keys now, and that's a pretty more of a recent feature in Rails, but that's a useful thing. Another audit patterns we've seen is having environmental variables to manage this. So you might have this stuff documented maybe on your servers or in your Docker containers so that Rails can read that from the environment when it runs. We are big fans of, storing everything as a team in like a password manager vault. We use 1Password, there's LastPass, a number of tools like that, but these details should not be something that you're copying and pasting in a Slack message or potentially, or just, again, back in the repository itself. That's problematic. We would really encourage you to, identify where these things are at, and then kind of iterate your way through the process to moving them into a different pattern for how to manage this stuff, because you don't want other people to find this stuff when they get invited to the repository. So I have a lot of passwords, that have been on my computer that I shouldn't have access to because I was just being called in as an independent code auditor of their application, and I shouldn't be given all that access because, well, I don't think I'm going to do anything nefarious. Doesn't mean someone else couldn't hack my computer, and then it's just like a lingering process. Sorry, the things kind of went a little out of control there. But I encourage you to move everything to 1Password or LastPass or some tool like that. Extract this from your Git repository. It's kind of got a little out of here, jumbled here. Technical difficulties there. I don't know what I did there, but yeah, again, consider using Rails encrypted secrets, using environmental variables in your deployment environments. This is just good best practices here. Another thing we want to talk about is like seeding your local database. So when you're working on your application, let's just think about the workflow for a second. Let's say you hadn't ever worked on your application and you were going to show up your first day at work and set up this application. Let's say you pull down the code base from GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, wherever, and you're following some instructions on how to set up the application. When it comes time to actually run the application locally, how much data does your application need to have before it can actually function? So, ideally Rails provides you with a concept called, seeding your database with, there's a seeds RB file, and there's some patterns for how you can populate a database. And to be honest, I would say anecdotally, 20–30% of the projects that come our way have seeds. Most of those teams have gotten into a scenario where, since they never really invested in that early on, they're really heavily reliant on a snapshot or like a subset snapshot of, say, a production or staging database. And so that might mean they're performing a MySQL dump, Postgres database dump, copying into their local machine, importing that, or maybe even doing some crazy stuff like over SSH tunnels and connecting to a live database, or getting a snapshot of a live database that they can connect to from their local environment, so they can build and do things in a similar environment, because they need like real data, because there's so much data in their systems that the idea of spending time building seeds just seems like a nice to have one day. But the problem is sometimes there's projects that have, and there's also another problem is that, if you're working with, say, Heroku or something, Heroku has some nice tools that will allow you to quickly download a database dump and import that, which seems easy, but that means now you might have confidential details about your end users or customers, whatever type of application you're running there, on your machine, which means if you're wandering around with your laptop, you might have real data. If you're not, and hopefully your application is being is encrypted, so that kind of reduces some of those concerns, but it's not uncommon for a laptop to get snatched away, and then there's that liability that your application has some security. You have a security hole in your process, basically. And so are you using database seeds? And not everybody, again, is using them, and I really encourage you spending time to do this. One of the things that we've found to be an effective use of intern time, actually, is to work on this. So you can kind of map out what's the bare minimum amount of data that your application needs, so that you can actually run it locally, potentially log into the application, perform some tasks. There's some ways to do that, or you can also do things like try to get the subset of real data and find there's probably some tools out there you can find that'll help you translate that data from the database into seeds files, so that you can massage it and maybe mask over or modify some of that data so you're not relying on any real data, but just like a good variation of that data, and then so that you can't necessarily identify who it originally belonged to. But yeah, if you're spending a lot of time manually loading databases on a regular time from production or staging, it's slowing your process down, and it makes it really hard to bring and introduce new developers to your process. And if you're going to ever need like an external development team, like say like Planet Argon, you shouldn't be giving us access to production database data. That's frowned upon, and we'll do it if we need to, and but it's definitely not ideal. Number 7, let's talk a little bit about database. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about database performance. There's a lot to uncover there, but one of the things we quite see, if you don't have a lot of experience on the database side of things, and maybe you might have a few database indexes on your tables, and the idea, and if you're not sure what a database table or a database index is, for example, it's basically when you have associated data in your application or something that you're going to be searching on. Let's say maybe that's a show me all associated data. Active Record does a really good job of making it easy to interact with associated data through, if one object has many other objects, when you do .other objects, it will go do a query to fetch that data. And so on the surface, that might not seem like it's a huge cost, but as your application grows and your database grows, that's going to become a very expensive query because you're doing that, quite exponentially and such. So quite often we see a lot of applications just don't have a lot of database indexes, and a really simple place to start if you're new to working on database indexes, and there's some articles in the newsletter that touch on this, and we'll include more on how to find things for more complex things. But at a very basic, simple level, every one of your foreign keys should probably have an index. So that's like usually the under ID column that's listed in your table. So let's say if you have a class or like an online course has many students. So the student may belong to a course. There's probably a better data structure for this, but for simplicity's sakes right now, the course underscore ID column in the student record should probably have an index. And one quick way to kind of see if there's a mismatch in the number of indexes is what we'll do is we'll run a quick command like this to to spit out a list of all of the IDs in the schema, the count, or how many times add index shows up, and do a word count on that. And then say in this example, it shows us 99, but how many indexes are there in the schema file? There's only 95. So we can see that there's maybe a disconnect there. There's only 4 we need to go in and patch. So this is a quick, helpful type of collection of tools to quickly run just to do some counts, but there's a lot of other complex data connection things, especially with a has and belongs to many, or tools like taggings, or where those types of objects, there's usually ways to do like multi-column indexes. A lot of times when you're doing things like on a state type column where if you're using like a state machine and you want to find things that are published, so things that will show up in your scopes are quite commonly very good candidates for needing an index. So if you're like courses.published, that's if you're always going through that and it's needing to do behind the scenes, it's performing a query that says like, select all of the courses that are published, and hitting against that column, then that column probably would benefit from a database index as well. And then you'll get a nice little performance boost really quickly. And if you don't do this, when we come in, and some of the first projects that we do is we'll go through and add in a bunch of these, then we can show them in some statistics that we've helped make the application X percentage faster. That makes us look really good as software developers. And I haven't heard very often too many product owners or clients say, "Oh wow, like no thank you. We don't want you to make our application faster." So take advantage of that. It's a quick win for quite often. Another kind of last thing I wanted to quickly touch on, and I'm trying to be mindful of time here, is to evaluate how many to-dos are found across your application. Whether you or someone else wrote these comments, we suggest that you regularly revisit those and see if you can address those technical debt and or revise the comment. For example, we find developers might have questions that they wrote for themselves, like what the hell does this do? As you see some examples in here, like this is from a real application that we've we recently worked with the client on, and these are to-dos, and this is probably something you see in your own application, and it's okay. But if you didn't write these and the person that did is no longer around, I would encourage you just to go clean those up. Remove them, try to make sense of them, of the code maybe around those to-dos, or if there's like, there's some examples here that's like flagged for removal. Actually, I think I went and looked at the home controller as an example, and it was not clear what they meant by that. So I don't know if that means it could be removed. It was flagged for remove. There's no history there. I couldn't find much from the Git history. So it's at this point, it's just noise. It's not going away because I'm going to be nervous to delete it until I really understand the application. I think developers are often overly worried about deleting things that they didn't write out of fear that it might be valuable one day. But if you and your peers on the project today don't understand it, just remove them, because it's adding noise and it's just going to kind of reinforce that there's things you don't understand in here, and that, which is okay inherently, but it's just noise. Clean things up, and or rephrase the stuff to make sense for other people so that you're not kind of like asking yourself later on. Again, I know that this was kind of like a high-level cursory review of things that you could be doing to start a code out of process. There's a lot of things we can get into really deep details when it comes to looking at more code, and we're going to have some more conversations about that in the near future. But kind of wanted to start up here, kind of high level, and then I'm going to open up now for some more Q&A with you folks. So, and before that, I just wanted to also mention, if you haven't heard or are not aware or you forgot about, I know things are a little chaotic in the world right now, but encourage you to head over to maintainable.fm and to subscribe to our podcast on Monday. Actually, your little secret, Sandy Metz will be episode number 50. That'll be published on Monday morning Pacific time. And so if you are not subscribing, you may want to do that so it will show up in your favorite podcasting application on Monday morning for you, or afternoon, or whatever time that might be published in your area. So feel free to subscribe and tell your peers to do that, and we're excited to have Sandy on the show on Monday. So let's open up for a little bit of Q&A. Let's see. Aaron asks, I run bundler audit on a personal project that I haven't touched in at least a year. That's interesting. Aaron, out of curiosity, did you already have bundler audit installed? Because you can run, I think it's a bundler audit update, which will update the database, and then you can run it again. But I would be really surprised that you have 0 vulnerabilities in your application, unless, I feel like it would hopefully give you an output. But if your local environment has any restrictions in terms of connecting to different URLs or host names and stuff on the internet over DNS, over the web to pull down new updates, so I'd be surprised. So okay. Anyways, well, that's good. And if you're still a little dubious about that, and feel free to maybe send me a quick email to robbie@planetargon.com, and with maybe a copy of your gem file, and I can do a quick sanity check on that. But that seems surprising. Like, we have, as an example, we just recently launched a Rails 6 application and into production about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we ran this right before we launched, and we had already had at least one security vulnerability pop up. So Omar asks, when you have no or very limited budget, what are the minimum indispensable types of automated tests you should write to get the most out of it with the least effort? Great question. Well, let's just say you don't have any testing at this point. I would encourage you to think about, if you were to say there's 3 things in the application that can't fail, like, is your application charging people money? Is it reliant on some types of users being able to perform a very mission critical set of tasks? Like, what are the scenarios when people are going to call you, panicking because something's not working right? And that thing, that would be good candidate for something that should probably have some tests around. So I think another way to think about this is when you're making changes in your application, what areas give you the highest level of anxiety when you're making changes to it? So our jobs is to make changes to software. We think of ourselves as, and kind of reflecting off some of the conversations I have from the Maintainable podcast, where I talk to a lot of really seasoned software developers that have kind of gone through this cycle of like having to understand that our role is to make changes to software. Sometimes we have the benefit of starting to write software, but to actually change software relies us in having a certain amount of confidence in what we're changing. And so if there are things that are easily repeatable to write tests around, I would encourage you to start there. Think about the critical things. And I wouldn't encourage you to go after necessarily, if you're unfamiliar with writing tests, I would encourage you to not start with the most difficult and complex set of tests, because you're probably might hit some roadblocks there and not sure how best to test it. But thinking about like, okay, here's a set of procedures that I expect to happen in the system. So maybe write some tests around, maybe start with some unit type tests on the model layer to kind of verify your logic. Maybe there's some calculations that are happening. You're feeding in some stuff into a method and you want to verify things are coming out the right way in different scenarios. Write tests that should not work to prove that it's doing the right thing. Sometimes it's not just testing the successful path, but trying to break it. Like and another thing would be if you have bugs that pop up, and can you write a test that reflect and duplicate that failing issue in the application so that you can fix it and then see that spec or test now turn successful. So those are some, I know that's kind of like and I often ask a lot of people on the podcast to for some really tangible advice here, and it's so contextual to your application that it's hard to do that without maybe spending some time sitting down and looking at the code base with you. But those are some things we often kind of focus on. So biggest bang for your buck is usually on a couple of core things that you can't really, your client doesn't want, or whoever's paying to invest in your software project doesn't want to see broken. And you can say that's like the whole application, but there's probably a few very specific things that are most important to them. It sounds like Aaron's had some success in running Update and sees a bunch of vulnerabilities. That's great. Let's see. About adding database indexes. What other red flags can I avoid as an individual who's writing the code? How can I leave the code in better shape than I found it? Great question. So, I know that without diving more into the database table, the indexes themselves, there's a lot of good literature on types of ways to work on some improvements there, but making things better than when you found it. So whether you wrote the code or someone else did, are you uncovering and coming across code that when you read it, you're having to kind of go potentially look up how a method works in Ruby, or maybe there's a little bit of magic happening, something that was potentially a little overly clever. As I was actually earlier today, I was listening to the Sandy Metz interview that'll be published on Monday, because we just got that back from our editor, and she was talking a lot about code that if you don't understand it quickly and you wrote it, you should probably refactor and clean it up, make it simpler. Let's not get overly clever with what we can do with Ruby. I know that there's Ruby gives us a lot of flexibility, for better or for worse at times, but if you don't understand what's going on, and there was an example recently, I was helping a junior developer that was working on one of our client projects, and they were looking at this block of code that was developed by a previous developer from the client side, and we were four of us were looking at it, trying to understand what it did, and we were able to rewrite those 4 or 5 lines of code in about 4 or 5 lines of code that were very, very explicit. So if you have, I think just thinking about what would be the most obvious way this could be written, and spending your time trying to make your code obvious to yourself and to your fellow software developers. And I know that's a subjective way to look at it, but that's kind of the best advice I can give you at this point on leaving these a little bit better state. So if you have, I think another thing is if you have some good candidates, if you have, one of the things we've often been encouraging in the Ruby on Rails community is to have skinny controllers and fat models. And we've seen plenty of controllers where you might have an action in a controller where you might have 50 to 100 lines of procedures happening in this controller to make something happen. Can you break that down into smaller pieces? Can you start extracting some of that functionality into smaller methods so that you can contain that, potentially into a few lines of code? It might be easier to interpret what's happening there if you don't have to read the whole thing, if you're just looking at the different methods that are being called within that controller action, but then maybe thinking about ways to even kind of push that down into maybe a service object or what have you. Same thing with your models. If you have really complex logic happening in like one method, break that stuff down. Just keep trimming, break it into smaller methods, make it very clear what's happening. Ruby gives us the ability to really lean on our normal language and to help document things so we don't have to have a lot of comments. So if you have areas of code that have a lot of comments to explain what's happening, rethink that and say, how could I turn these comments into code and make the code reflect something that's much more readable? Again, that's why Ruby is such a great language for us, is that it's very readable. And if you're not able to read the Ruby code, then you've probably been a little too clever. I've got time for maybe one or two quick more questions. And Aaron, I'm glad to see that you were able, again, that you're able to, get a handle on all those vulnerabilities. And, what my advice there is, when you start looking at that, is look at the highly critical ones first. Those are obviously most important. I would encourage you to do that over a series of periods of time. We'll often create tickets for each one of those by gem, maybe as an example. And that way we're not trying to do one big pull request that tries to change like 20 to 30 gems at the same time, because could be opening up a Pandora's box. And those can be sometimes tricky to get through. And I've often wished that there was like a way to like Bundler Audit could like give you some advice, but at least focus on the highly critical ones first, especially if you have a publicly exposed application, and say if your action view or there's something that could potentially allow an external nefarious person to script something to hit your server. If you have an application that's fortunately hidden behind a firewall and it's only accessible to an internal user group, some of those concerns might be less of a concern because you're only worried about some internal nefarious action there. So. Well, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. So I wanted to take a quick moment just again, thank you all for just swinging by and listening. I know that, and thank you for subscribing to Maintainable Rails and for subscribing to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Planet Argon and or have some follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us at Robbie@planetargon.com, and enjoy your weekend when you get to it.